Hello and welcome to today's video. Today's video is the second in a series, and I'm not sure how long it's going to be, about your next camera and some factors that go into deciding which one is potentially best for you. The first video was about choosing between mirrorless and DSLR camera, and hopefully after you watch that video, which I linked up here, you've come to the wise and correct conclusion that mirrorless is right for you in your next camera. I know. Seriously though, choosing a camera is obviously very personal, and it's a lot of fun, but it's also a lot of stress. But watch that video, see what you think, share your thoughts and comments, and maybe DSLR is right for you, even if you are wrong. You're still, we still love you. All right, so this video is about the next big question you have to ask yourself in considering camera choices, which are so many because it's a wonderful time to be a photographer. That next question you have to decide is what size of the sensor in your camera do you want to use? So the reason that's important is each sensor size comes with its own unique set of advantages and disadvantages. And just like in choosing between mirrorless and DSLR, there's no perfect camera. So here's a quiz for you. Are you ready for your quiz? Did you study? How could you study? You didn't know what the quiz was going to be. Anyway, here's the quiz. One question. In current times, which is August 2021, how many consumer/pro camera sensor sizes are there for us mere mortals who don't have our own rocket ships? So how many sensor sizes are there currently available? Are you ready? What do you think? The answer, of course, is 4. There are 4 sensor sizes available. To us, again, kind of mere mortals, relatively affordable. So I'll talk about each. We'll talk a little bit about how their sizes. We'll talk about their advantages, disadvantages. We'll get into this whole gnarly thing called crop factor. And then hopefully you'll have a little more information at the end of the video to help you decide which sensor size might be better for you. Full disclosure, as I like to do, my camera of choice is a mirrorless Fujifilm X-T3, which is what's called an APS-C sensor size. So the size of the sensor here is what's called a crop sensor. We'll get into what that means in a little bit. But that's my sensor size. I have a surprise at the end of the video that I'll talk about relative to that camera and what I would choose if I was doing things differently. So if you want to skip, use the chapter markers below. If you find a part of the video that looks more interesting to you, please feel free to use that to get to the part that's most interesting to you. All right, so let's get started, and we're going to start with a comparison of the 4 different sensor sizes. So here we go. Here are the 4 different sensor sizes. Starting at the smallest is micro 4/3. We move up to APS-C, which is, as I mentioned, this camera type. This is fairly common, especially in DSLR land, and they're especially in the lower, below $1,000 price range in DSLR cameras. Next up in sensor size is full frame. What does full frame mean? That references back to the day of 35mm film cameras, the most popular type of film camera from the 70s through the 90s, and using that as the reference point for sensor size. So that's basically 1.0. When we talk about measurements and lenses, relative view angles, we use the 35mm as our starting point. And then we go out one more size. The 4th size is medium format, and I should kind of have that in quotes, medium format, because it's not traditional medium format. It's for a marketing speak, and it's kind of agreed upon language now, but it's the next sensor size up from full frame. So that leads into a conversation of what's called crop factor. crop factor refers to the imaging area that these different sensors have relative to the imaging area of 35 millimeter film or full frame sensors. So I'm showing you just the two sensors overlaid here, two sensor sizes, the crop sensor, APS-C, which is this one, and then the full frame. I don't have a full frame mirrorless camera. I just have my old film camera to show you for reference. So the reason it's called crop sensor and crop factor is because the sensor is smaller. When you look at the same image through a same focal length, it's going to show you less. It's going to be cropped. It's somewhat magnified, but it's mostly a smaller field of view. Keep that in mind, okay? So it's a multiplier factor when the sensor is smaller. It'll be, well, let's just show you the graphics. So here are the different crop factors for these four sensors. Again, 1.0 is our starting point on the full frame, the 35 millimeter-ish equivalent to film. So a micro four thirds crop sensor is a 2 times crop factor, which means if you have a 50 millimeter lens on a micro four thirds camera, its field of view, what it sees, the crop portion, the smaller version, will be equivalent to what, so 2 times 50 is 100, so 100 millimeters lens, focal length lens, on a full frame camera. It's a little tricky, it's math. So basically, here's how this works. The smaller sensors kind of get you more, they get you a narrower field of view, which has the effect of appearing more telephoto. And it's harder to get those really, really wide angles because you're basically cropping everything. You have a smaller area to look through. APS-C, again, my camera size that I'm currently using, is 1.5 crop factor. So that 50 millimeter lens will have 1.5 times 50 is 75. So it has equivalent field of view. What you can see is equivalent to a 75 millimeter lens on a full frame or a camera. So yeah, and then a full frame will be one time crop, so there's no crop because it's the standard. That's where the starting point. And then you get to the medium format, it goes in the other direction because it's larger. So its crop is about 0.8. So that 50 millimeter lens times 0.8 has a wider field of view, actually. It'd be about 40 millimeters. Math, science, history, unraveling the mystery. Sorry, I watched too much Big Bang. Anyway, so that's how crop factor works. When you go to the camera store, when you read camera stuff, when you watch videos and they're talking about crop factor, that's what it's about. Smaller sensors will see less of a scene than the larger sensors. That's basically what it's all about. So you're basically zooming in, even though magnification kind of happens, but not really. It's showing you less. Physics, optics, that. Okay, so that's crop factor. If you have questions, leave a comment below. Please, please, please. It's hard to explain. I hope I did an okay job. So next, what I like to do is two things. First, all of the modern cameras of any sensor size will take amazing photos. They will allow you to create images you'll be really happy with that will technically and artistically and aesthetically look good. The main thing I want to talk about next is kind of the physical specifications of these different cameras and what you can expect. This is far from exhaustive, but it's a sample of a couple cameras at each of the different sensor sizes. And I'm going to use as my reference point this camera because I can hold it up and show you. And I'm not a huge person. I'm kind of average size person. So you can see how those cameras might compare to this camera. And there's a cool website out there called camerasize.com. And that's where I sourced this stuff. You can literally put the cameras side by side and I'll show you, well, I'll show you what it shows you. It shows you this. So let's start with our friends, the Micro Four Thirds camera. So micro four thirds is the smallest sensor size of the four we're talking about. And what I'll do is for each camera, show you the camera name, the size, how many megapixels it has, the price, and how much it weighs. So you can get a sense of relative to this. So we'll start with this Olympus OMD. What a mouthful for a whole bunch of letters in the name. Wow. I'll stick with XT4. Thank you very much. So a 20 megapixel sensor, about $700, so really good value. Very small camera, very small camera. So smaller than this, and lighter as well, 335 grams. Moving on. Now, just because the sensor's smaller doesn't mean the camera is going to be smaller. And we'll also see just because the sensor's larger doesn't mean this camera is going to be larger. So let's take a look at another sample from the Micro Four Thirds cameras, and that's this Panasonic GH5 Mark II, which is a larger physically larger and heavier and about same price camera as my Fuji X-T4. And this camera is a little different. It's geared not a little more, quite a bit more towards video. That's kind of its first role is video. So that's what this camera is for. The larger body helps dissipate heat because you run a lot more heat through a sensor when you're shooting video all the time because the sensor is active all the time. So that's Micro Four Thirds. Some are smaller, some are larger. Let's move to APS-C. Again, this is our baseline camera for this conversation because it's the one I have and can hold in my hand. And let's look at an entry-level-ish Nikon camera, the Z50. Same physical sensor size, a few less megapixels at 20.9. And the price is $860, so it's about half the price. And it weighs a little bit less, quite a bit less actually than the Fuji. I'm guessing the reason it weighs less is there's more plastic components. That's often in the sub $1,000 cameras. One way that money is saved is using more plastic than metal. Plus construction is probably not as weather resistant, so on and so forth. So smaller, even though it's the same size sensor. And then Sony, in their APS-C crop sensor cameras, only has this style, this rangefinder style. So it doesn't have the traditional kind of DSLR looking hump on top, which isn't needed. It just kind of elevates the eyepiece and gives you more room for a screen and things, in addition to a viewfinder. So this camera is roughly equivalent in weight. Size is a little shorter, so you kind of put it in your pocket kind of thing. $1,400, 24 megapixels. So there you go. So let's look at another APS-C. Actually, we're moving to full frame. I apologize. So this is now moving into the entry-level price point of full frame, which is fascinating. This is why I suggest people consider mirrorless. There are so many more options. You now have full frame, that larger sensor size, available at around $1,000 in the EOS RP from Canon. 26 megapixels, so it's the same number of dots, but they're in a larger space. I'll get to what the advantage of that is in a little bit. $1,000, and it's even lighter. So it's physically smaller, lighter, and less expensive than my smaller sensor camera. What do you trade off for that price? Probably some video capabilities. Again, the weather sealing, weather resistance. I don't know all the specifics of the EOS R. Go to your local camera store and ask them. So next we have a kind of a mid-level camera, the EOS R5. Less megapixels, which is a relatively common thing to do when you want to get to higher ISO sensitivity quality. Of photos, less noise. The pixels need to be a little larger, gather more light. Anyway, $2,500 US, heavier camera, a little bit physically larger camera. So this is typical. To get a larger sensor and to get more features, functions, and such, you generally need a larger body to do that. It's just kind of physics. Again, we have heat dissipation and such like that. So Sony is amazing in their engineering. They pack a whole bunch of stuff into a package this small. 50 megapixels, $6,500. It's heavier. Yeah, and if you know anything about Sony cameras, there's about 4 cameras that look like this: the A7, A7R, A7S, and then the A9, and then this guy. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of cameras that look very similar and have different specific markets within Sony, different emphasis. So lots of many options for your Sony fans. Now, this is Sony's flagship. It's their highest end current camera in mirrorless full frame. Nikon and Canon have their flagship cameras in DSLR, and they have not yet released a flagship mirrorless camera. That's about to change. Again, this is August 2021. Canon's starting to release some information on their R3, their big dog. There's not a lot of information about it. Specifics, the body's images have been released. The sensors rumored to be about 24 megapixels, so actually less dots, but in a larger space, so potentially higher image quality. I'm guessing weight is going to be similar to the existing 1DX Mark III, which is about 6,000 grams, so it's a heavy guy. And price probably $6,500-ish, again, kind of equivalent to the 1DX Mark III. So Nikon's also working on their flagship. Little information's out on that right now. I think it's going to be called the Z9. Rumors is that both of these have been seen at the Olympics, the Canon and Nikon flagship. So there you go. If you want the big dog, you can still get it. All right, last stop here on sensor size and camera comparison is to that medium format sensor size, that next size up from full frame. And that gets us to this. There are 2 manufacturers of these guys, again, in the stuff that most of us can afford, let's say under $10,000, and that's Hasselblad and Fujifilm. And Fujifilm released this relatively recently, the GFX 100S, 100 megapixels, so double what that the flagship Sony has. And megapixels aren't everything. I hope you know that already. But there's a lot of them. $6,900, 821 grams in a package that's actually not much larger than this, and that's pretty astonishing from an engineering standpoint. So that's a kind of quick overview of some of the options available at the different camera sizes and price points. There's lots of them. So you have many, many options, which is awesome. One more thing to do as far as comparison, let's talk about lenses. Those options are almost endless, but what I wanted to do is do a quick comparison of a very common lens and focal length, which is a 24 to 70 millimeter zoom lens. Yeah, so the Panasonic 12 to 35. So remember that crop factor of ×2? So that's a 24 to 70 equivalent of what it will see through the viewfinder. You can see it is very, very small. It's not super cheap at $1,000, but it's small, it's light, and that's one reason that people often buy those Micro Four Thirds camera is they are ultra portable. Going to the Fujifilm 16 to 55. At about $1,200, 655 grams. I would hold it up and show it to you, but it's recording this video right now. Moving up to Canon full frame, they get bigger. Canon and Sony, both of those cameras are larger, more expensive. One thing that happens with the physics involved in covering a larger sensor area is because you're covering it with a circle, is that things get proportionally larger and heavier, and optical glass is very expensive. So the engineering and the size and the weight gets quite a bit more significant as you design lenses for larger sensors. And we go to the Fuji side of things, we get to the 24 to 70, which is as close as I can find. They don't have a ton of lenses for the GFX, but it's heavier, it's larger, but than even the full frame. So there's a quick lens comparison. You'll notice the size difference most in these zoom lenses, a little less so in the primes, but the primes, especially on the Micro Four Thirds, can be pretty tiny. So there you go. All right, next let's talk about some of the advantages and disadvantages from a kind of a technical standpoint of of each of these systems. So we'll start with Micro Four Thirds. And again, before I start this, just a reminder, from what I know and have seen examples of, there are really no bad cameras out there in any of these systems sensor sizes. So there's photographers taking amazing photos with Micro Four Thirds and APS-C and medium format and full frame, obviously. So there you go. So let's walk through the advantages and disadvantages of each. We'll start with Micro Four Thirds advantages. And here's a cool thing about Micro Four Thirds. If you have a Micro Four Thirds camera, any of the and you have a lens, it'll fit on any Micro Four Thirds camera, even if it's a different manufacturer. So that Panasonic lens will fit on an Olympus body and vice versa. That's how the system was originally designed as a standard. So that's kind of cool. Easy cross brand lens sharing. They can be engineered to be much smaller and lighter because they have a smaller sensor. So you need less processing power. You need less physical space to dissipate heat because the sensor isn't as large. Plus, then everything just gets tiny and tidy potentially. Again, because of that small sensor, what that means as far as processing is you can build some pretty amazing video capabilities into those cameras as well. So that's why you'll see Blackmagic uses that sensor size in some of their cinema cameras, as Panasonic does. So it's a pretty common sensor size in some video cameras. Lens size, because it's covering that smaller sensor, can be pi r squared reduced theoretically in size because it's using a circular lens elements. So again, you have the potential for a much smaller package of camera and lens. Another potential advantage some people like is because of the smaller sensor, and this is true of as we progress, the smaller sensors will have a deeper depth of field. So they'll have more in focus from front to back in a given scene at a given aperture than a larger sensor would. So that means at f2.8, you might get a lot more in focus than you would at f2.8 in a full frame, which means for landscape photographers, you can potentially not have a tripod because you can take the photo at f2.8 that you might have to use f5.6 or f8 even, and have a slower shutter speed. So trade-offs. It's a thing. Disadvantages to Micro Four Thirds. There's only two current manufacturers. So Panasonic and Olympus. And Olympus just recently sold off their camera division. So I think it's called OMD Imaging now. No, it's all OM Digital. That's not what it's called. So not a ton of options out there. Not a ton of options. Another downside disadvantage is generally poor performance as you turn the ISO up. That smaller sensor, as you run more current through it to amplify it or whatever magic happens to make that happen, you do end up with more noise. So there's more image noise at higher ISO in those smaller sensors. Another downside potentially, especially for landscape photographers maybe, is because it's cropped 2 times, it's hard to engineer really wide angle lenses. So 18 millimeter equivalent or wider is hard to get and few options to get in my experience with Micro Four Thirds. While it's an advantage to some, that deep depth of field can be a disadvantage to others, especially generally portrait photographers who want that blurrier background, that deeper separation between subject and background that you can get with wider apertures. Harder to get that with Micro Four Thirds. And lastly, the future is, I think, a little uncertain on this. I just did a little research on this. I don't know that Panasonic has any rumors going on or anything new coming out. Although the GH5 Mark II is relatively new, and OM Digital, formerly Olympus, also unsure plans for their future products. So it's a little maybe scarier from what's next standpoint, but there are currently some really neat offerings in both systems. So there you go. All right, moving on to APS-C, which is again this camera, the one I use. Some advantages: they are generally smaller, lighter, and less expensive than full frame. Excellent image quality at even higher ISO settings. My experience is it's about a stop less that you can crank up the ISO and still maintain similar image quality from a noise standpoint. So that means maybe your full frame can go to 6,400 ISO. Your your APS-C might be able to go to 3,200. You still get similar image quality. Another advantage is there are many options. This has been being developed for over 10 years, so there's lots and lots of options, lots of engineering. These are amazing image quality options out there and performance options. The 1.5 crop factor it can be an advantage, especially for sports or other types of photography where you want to get closer. So that crop factor can help you do it with a lens that is not as physically large as on a full frame. And then again, that relatively little bit smaller sensor can be engineered for better video performance, 4K, 8K, that kind of stuff, because it's physically smaller and potentially lower resolution, so it's easier to engineer around that. All right, some disadvantages to APS-C. It does have less background blur than full frame. So at f2.8 on a full frame camera will get you a blurrier background, so like this here, than my APS-C sensor will. So a little less background separation from subjects. Some people it's important, some people not so much. As I mentioned, another disadvantage is approximately one stop less high ISO usability, although that's kind of shrinking a little bit, and it depends on your preference and taste for how noise looks in your images. One thing I really like about Fujifilm cameras is their sensor array is a little different than most. And one of the results of that is their noise pattern in this camera tends to be, to my eye, more organic looking. It looks a little bit more like film grain, has that kind of retro look than digital looking. So that's an okay thing for me. Another disadvantage, currently there are a few less choices of mirrorless APS-C cameras, the crop sensor. Sony only has rangefinder options currently. Canon does not offer a true APS-C camera. They have their M series, which uses a whole different systems of lenses, and the future of that is uncertain. So there's a few less options. The big players are Nikon, Fuji, and Sony right now. So, and currently, there's less size, weight, and performance difference, price difference, between APS-C and full frame. And that really surprised me as I was doing this research. I was thinking, well, it'd be easy. Just tell everybody start with an APS-C camera. But as you saw, there are smaller, lighter, less expensive full frame versions. May not have all the features, but you get that image quality and that potential blurrier background kind of thing. So yeah, there's tons and tons of options. So that there weren't there when I made the switch 7 years ago in 2014. When I first got this, I don't know if there were any full frame mirrorless cameras out there. So now there are quite a few. Speaking of full frame, let's talk about their advantages. First, the fact that they've gotten rid of the actual mirror mechanism in mirrorless cameras. So this is, again, the mirror that existed in DSLR cameras. I know this is a film, but it'll show you the idea. So without having this physical engineering required, you can make the camera physically smaller, especially for depth. It can be not as deep. One thing with mirrorless cameras I think everybody still clings to is ooh, it's going to be smaller and lighter. Sure it is, until you stick a big old 2.8 70 to 200 lens on there, then this gets big. So anyway, there's opportunity for size and weight reductions because of the mirrorless mechanism rather than the physical mirror mechanism of DSLRs. Excellent image quality, especially at higher ISO settings. The physically larger sensor allows for physically larger pixels, which gather light more efficiently and need less amplification. Currently, there are in systems there are the most options for camera bodies and lenses in full frame than in any of the other sensor sizes. So if you like lots of options, full frame is good for you. It's easier to get that wide angle field of view. So in addition to having excellent image quality, you can have that landscape, really wide, big picture scene. And again, easier to get the background blur with the larger sensor at f2. This is being filmed at f2.8, recorded at 2.8. This background would be blurrier on a full frame camera. And then another advantage of full frame is that there are options for higher resolution. Both Canon, Nikon, Sony make 40 and 50 megapixel options. So if you want to get lots and lots of dots and have really large file sizes, those options are available to you in full frame camera that aren't available at the smaller sensor sizes. And then disadvantages of full frame, generally, but not always, but when you go for feature parity with especially an APS-C crop sensor, the cameras are going to be heavier, more expensive, and larger in a full frame. Again, it's just physics, engineering to make everything happen. So that's the major potential disadvantage, especially that price thing. At least it is for me. And then on my bullet points as I'm reading these, the second bullet point is I've got nothing else to list here. There's really not a ton of disadvantages to the full frame mirrorless cameras nowadays, at least that I could think of. If you have some to add, let me know below. Show me. All right, let's talk about medium format for just a moment. And the major advantage here is those really high resolution sensors, 50 and 100 megapixel. That's what Fuji and Hasselblad offer in their medium format camera. So if you need to print it large, there you go. Or if you just love to have the option for super high resolution files that's important to your photography, medium format might be the way to go, unless you're a sports photographer. The image quality and detail in those sensors is just spectacular. They're engineered for image quality first. A lot of full frame and APS-C cameras are image quality. Let's say if image quality on a medium format is 100, we'll say on a APS-C and a full frame, it's engineered to be 95 image quality, but also 95 on ISO performance, focusing speed, burst mode, video. So it does all those other things really, really well, and a slight potential that I can't really see, reduction in image quality. Medium format image quality comes first. You get really shallow depth of field at any given aperture compared to full frame or APS-C or micro four thirds, because that sensor is again larger, which creates at any given aperture more background blur potential if that's what you like. Disadvantages to medium format, again, larger, heavier, more expensive, especially. Fuji is rumored currently on the expensive side and larger side to be having a GFX50S, which I'm guessing will be around $5,000, which is still a lot of money. But for medium format, that's pretty impressive. Medium format are generally not engineered for fast-paced photography or for video. They will do it, but it's not what their first and main purpose is. Again, you've got sensors that have so much information in them that you need really powerful computer to chew on that stuff, process it, save it to the memory card, and all that. And again, they're also not generally engineered for high ISO settings and low noise. So even though the sensor is larger, they're not engineered to perform really well at high ISO settings. Whew, that's a lot of stuff. Yeah, there's lots and lots of things to consider, and this is just a start. I hope it's been a little helpful. Um, One of the things that surprised me as I was doing this research, as I mentioned, if I started today, I don't know what system I would choose. I don't know 100% I'd still pick Fuji. There's some intangibles I really like about the system, and their lenses are amazing. So I'd probably still choose Fuji, but there are so many wonderful options in full frame from about $1,000 up to close to $10,000 that, if you're not sure and you want maybe the most room to grow, most room to grow into, most flexibility, most compatibility with things, most options, full frame might be a good place to start. So that surprised me. Yeah, so something to consider. Some buying advice. One thing as you consider all these options, and there's so many, is if you have a nearby camera store, go make a visit. Even if you have to drive a little ways. My experience of the camera stores near us in Seattle, which is Glazer's and Kenmore Camera, they're amazing folks. They have their sales reps are really interested in helping you, and it's almost like an interview. They'll ask you really good questions about what do you want to do, what do you think you're going to use it for, what kind of stuff do you imagine you would do next with your photography. So they want to help you find a camera you can grow into that fits your needs and your budget, and that's a really good resource to not overlook. And especially with these kind of cameras, nobody has a much better price. If you find $1,000 camera for $600, run away, because it's probably not good, really. So there's a thing called minimum advertised pricing. So the online big stores that are camera stores, B&H, Adorama, even Best Buy, they have to advertise at the same price unless they get permission. So you're not going to find huge price savings, but you will get potentially better customer service. And if you go today and find a camera you like, you can walk out with it and not wait for the delivery to arrive tomorrow or however long it takes. So that's my personal opinion and preference. Visit your local, support local. It's always a good thing. 3 things to remember as you consider buying your next camera. 1, there are no perfect cameras. No camera out there is going to do everything exactly the way you want at the price you want. This just doesn't exist. 2nd, any new camera, and I think I've said this a couple times already, will be amazing from a technical standpoint. They will create aesthetically wonderful images, technically awesome images. So one camera is not going to have, in my opinion and experience, significantly better image quality than another. There will be incremental differences, but not one camera is going to embarrass you and one camera will make you the next Ansel Adams. So that's not true. And 3rd thing to remember is no matter when you buy a camera, there will be a new camera released really soon after it. So the best time to buy a new camera was yesterday, and the second best time is today from that standpoint. I hope this video has been a little bit helpful to consider some of the factors of different camera sensor sizes and how it might relate to your camera buying decision. So I hope you have a lot of fun in this time as you consider your next camera. If you have factors or thoughts you think should be added to this conversation, please list them in the comments below. I'm glad to be in that conversation. And as I'm required by YouTube law, if you get a chance and liked what you've seen and want to see more, subscribe to this channel. That'd be greatly appreciated. Give this video a like, because that helps train the YouTube algorithm to videos that you prefer. And what else should you do? Be nice to someone today. That's always good too. Yeah, say hello, say thank you, hold the door, all that good stuff. So until we meet again in the next video, I hope you have a wonderful time creating photos. Be safe, be well, and I will see you soon. So bye for now.